Welcome back as we continue this series looking at the early days of the Cybis Studio in Trenton, New Jersey. A little known fact is that the Cybis Studio wasn't always known by this name. It wasn't until 1953 that Boleslaw Cybis incorporated the new name Cybis Studio. From late 1939 to 1942, production was unincorporated. Boleslaw and Marja initially set up a small shop in the space they leased in the Steinway Mansion in Astoria, New York. It was here they re-enlisted the help of their dear friend Marilyn Kozik, who had worked with them in painting the murals for the World's Fair. In the Steinway studio, they created cold cast figures of people, angels, animals, birds, and flowers. These items, called Papka, were made from a plaster similar in composition to that of chalkware. As a result, they were easily broken and few survive today. They do periodically turn up for sale, but rarely without damage. Even though these earliest sculptures were not made of refined material or fired at high temperatures like other earthenware available at the time, they still sold well. They sold so well that by late 1940, Boleslaw began planning his move from New York to New Jersey, where he would buy property and build kilns to fire fine china and porcelain decorative items. During this period, a notable transition took place in the sculptures made by Boleslaw and Marja. If dividing the works created by the Cybises into phases, this would be the second phase of their work. This is easily differentiated by the signatures found on these works, as well as a shift in style and material. Early Papka sculptures were dated, with most surviving examples found with the year 1940. As a rule, items were not dated after this period, and it wasn't until the late 1960s that a significant deviation from this practice was noted by the studio. After Boleslaw built his kilns in Trenton, molded sculptures, many of which would be carried forward into the third phase of production under the Cordey name, were produced with Papka applications. These hybrid pieces were partially fired, then plaster-like decorations were added which were not fired. They were attached as hair, articles of clothing, and floral adornments. Examples exist with the core piece of the sculpture having been fired and the decoration applied using the older composition of Papka. This is clearly a transitional point from plaster to fired china. It indicates Cybis was clearly experimenting as he refined the formula he would ultimately use in creating hard-fired china and later porcelain sculptures. These pieces are usually marked M.B. Cybis in blue. As the transformation from Papka to china continued, new designs were fully fired china with no Papka decoration at all. This evolution took place utilizing only the blue M.B. Cybis hallmark signature. This signature would continue until production started on the Cordey line. The earliest fully fired pieces from the Trenton kilns on Church Street were signed M.B. Cybis. This hallmark was used for about 2 years and seems to have been retired around 1942 or at the dawn of the third phase known as Cordey. The business Boleslaw had been developing was about to take off as a new company. The company's future success was guaranteed when Boleslaw partnered with two men, Harvey Greenberg, who he met at the 1939 World's Fair, and Harry Wilson, both of Philadelphia. The three men formed the Cordey China Company. The company would produce china figurines, busts, vases, cups, saucers, trinket boxes, and other various accessories. Boleslaw, Marja, Marilyn, and a small staff of women that worked in the studio produced some of the few beautiful items available during World War II, as most commercial production shifted toward the war effort. China was not a material heavily utilized in war goods, so there was no shortage of material in producing the items Cordey provided to a market anxious for decorative giftware. The overwhelming vast majority of items produced by Cordey were designed by Marja or Boleslaw and made by hand. The Papka designs clearly carried over to the China designs utilized by Cordey. Papka influence is seen in the curly hair of people, the flowers and leaves of plants, and birds and animals. A signature design of most Cordey items depicting people were those of roses and lace. Cotton lace was soaked in porcelain slip before being applied to figures and then fired. The cotton disintegrated during the firing process, leaving a lace copy made of china. This was a technique developed in Europe, which Boleslaw and Marja had learned early in their career and executed with great success in their own studio. The heavy application of lace and rose adornments gave Cordey an immediately recognizable style, setting it apart from the competition. The company was extremely successful, enabling the Cybises to enjoy all the benefits of the American way of life. After the war, business continued to boom and workers had jobs. It was during this time labor movements were expanding and unions were forming rapidly. By the early 1950s, many working for Cordey had an interest in forming a union, even though accounts from the studio were unanimous that Boleslaw was fair and a good employer. Still, many employees were persuaded to organize, but a problem developed when two separate union groups became territorial and formed picket lines blockading the company. This prevented the arrival of needed materials and the shipment of finished products. The stranglehold placed on Cordey nearly forced it to close. Boleslaw was successful in suing to stop the picket lines, as one of the unions represented had no legal grounds to disrupt business by forming a blockade. By the time that the court ruled, Cordey was struggling. The order came within the nick of time, but unfortunately, much damage had been done to the company. With the legal issues behind him, Boleslaw decided to part ways with Cordey and to move forward with a new venture under the name Cybis Studio. This was the next step, or fourth phase, in the evolutionary process that created the most spectacular porcelain firm of the 20th century that would produce the greatest works ever delivered in porcelain art. Thank you for viewing this video, and I hope you will watch the others in the series to learn more about the history of America's premier porcelain art studio, Cybis.